Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome. The sun is shining. All right, at this time, we'll call to order the Yamhill County Board of Commissioners formal informal session for March 25th, 2021. Christian, would you please lead us in the pledge?
Certainly. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Justice for all. Thank you all. Well, praying for our nation, our state, and our country these days. We're in some challenging times, but appreciate everybody being here. And we'll start with the calendar session. Commissioners, anything to add to our normal joint calendar?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair.
Thank you.
No, Chair, thank you.
We'll move on to public comment, and thank you to Carolina Rook, who submitted comments last evening and as late as just a few minutes ago. And we have had an opportunity to read those, correct, Commissioners? Thank you,
Yes,
everybody
Chair.
who took the time to send a public comment. I have to say that I know that this board has traditionally read all of them, and so they are appreciated. We'll move on to our work session, and this time is reserved for topics of discussion. This is a work session that has been continued over from March 18th. The first one is a review and a discussion of the next steps for the Yamhalis West Sider Trail Bridge project, the master planning, and the grants. So the way I look at it, I think that I'm hoping that we're not going to come to any firm conclusions at this point because there's so many different parts that have to be put together. But I see it as us needing to come up with what is our obligation, what are our options, and what are our goals. Hi, Carrie. And soon to be joined by, I'm sure, her feline companion. But anyway.
Puppy, Chair. Sometimes there's a puppy.
Oh, okay. Good to know. And there's Todd joining us. So, but basically, I'm looking at first to find out what our obligations are, the options, and the goals. Does everybody pretty much see that that's the scope of what we're here to talk about today?
Yes, Chair.
Okay. And one of the things that I'd really like, perhaps if Christian would start us off with what our obligations are, or maybe that's a question for Ken Huffer. Our obligations at this point, and I don't necessarily mean a dollar amount, but just overall what the obligations are and to whom. And then in terms, perhaps Christian, you can talk a little bit about, we'd asked ODOT to join us today, and they chose not to join us in this forum, but we're hoping to have a further discussion on that. But maybe just overall the obligations.
Sure, and I'll try and limit it to the current contractual obligations initially, and then if there are other obligations that you'd like me to discuss, we can do that. But as we've talked about, we have the Connect 6 grant, which ODOT has informed us that they will be looking for repayment. In addition, under that grant, well, it's a separate grant, but we had an additional $75,000 grant from Oregon Parks and Recreation Department that they will be seeking repayment of. And there are, again, when we're talking about obligations, there are some outstanding invoices and obligations from our contractors under those grants that are still to be addressed. So there may still be some additional cost associated with that project, depending on what the board decides to do in terms of remobilization to complete construction, demobilization to reverse what's been done, or hold steady with the status quo. So there may be some obligations involved in that discussion. So that's the Connect 6 grant. Depending on where the board decides to go with the trail as a whole, there could be obligations under our acquisition grants from ODOT.
Ken?
And there is the master planning grant. And I'm trying to think of any other sort of immediate contractual obligations or issues that we've already talked about that we would need to have the board discuss further. Carrie, am I missing something obvious?
I just wanted to, and you mentioned the master plan, but I think that one is because Alta, I mean, we have a current grant agreement. Alta is in a holding pattern, so that's actually more immediate than the acquisition discussions at this point.
Yeah. We have a lease agreement with the bus barn property that at some point the board would I'd like the board to discuss and give us some direction on where the board's thoughts are on that and the direction you're thinking about going.
Okay.
As far as immediate obligations, that I think covers it.
Okay, great. So that gives us a sort of a starting point. And the next, so well,
Chair-
that would bring up.
Chair, I would think I think there were two that I wrote down that I didn't hear, which is maintenance, some level of maintenance of the corridor. And then, sorry, I'm trying to read my own handwriting here. Apologies. Oh my gosh, so maintenance of the corridor. There is one other one, but I'll get to it. The erosion control. So we do need to do something kind of remob, demob. We still need to do erosion control plan.
Okay, thank you. So while we're still on this topic, we know that ODOT was not interested in discussing terms at this point in terms of repayment in this forum, but
Right. In this forum.
But what was their suggestion and what is your suggestion on how we could best go about that and what would that look like?
Yeah, so we invited them as the board requested. And I don't have the email in front of me, so I apologize. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but essentially they declined to attend today's session to negotiate repayment terms in a public meeting. They are interested and wanting to move forward to discuss repayment options and what a repayment plan might look like. Their preference would be that occur at the staff level initially, and then after following those conversations, then if that's the way we proceeded, then we would bring back whatever had been discussed with ODOT. And I've mentioned this to each of you individually. I think it would be appropriate, and if a commissioner wanted to be a part of those conversations, I think there would be another set of issues we'd have to deal with if we wanted more than one commissioner to be involved in those staff level conversations. I would hope that there would be someone possibly from the director's office or someone like that from ODOT involved in those conversations. So that's, one reason why I think it would be acceptable to have a commissioner there, but that's what they've suggested, and so this is really our opportunity to talk about what we'd like to see and how we'd like to proceed, and then we can continue to have those conversations.
So we would set up a meeting with ostensibly a commissioner and staff and ODOT, and they would come to some agreement on what, or at least not an agreement, but perhaps the preliminary offer of what they would be comfortable with. Commissioners' interest in being part of that discussion? Commissioner Berschauer? Commissioner Berschauer?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. In the last meeting last week, I mentioned that this is definitely of interest to me to be part of these discussions. And I think it's a benefit to the county to have somebody who has not been a part of the transactions that have occurred prior to this year. So I would like to be involved. Christian, is there a scenario where if it was all three of us that they would be amenable to meeting? Is there some sort of forum or something where we could if it was all three of us, that would be appropriate, or are they just saying no to that?
I mean, the only situation I could see where that might work would be in an executive session. If we could find a justifiable basis to have that kind of a discussion in an executive session, I can look into that and see if given what we're discussing with them, whether or not that would meet the elements of being able to go into executive session. They may be more comfortable having a conversation in executive session. We can ask them that.
Commissioner Kula, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Because there were to echo concerns that have been raised by my colleagues, for full transparency, I think it would be best to have more than one commissioner there.
Well, I think we should have all commissioners there if we can possibly get them to agree to that. And I'll tell you why. We all have distinct history and perspectives on this project, and we've all been with the board various times. And I think it would be good to have that, not only the sort of the historical perspective, but the pros, the cons, the different way of approaching this. So Christian, if they're agreeable to that, maybe we could do that in executive session, because it's not that we didn't ask them to be here so that all three of us could have that discussion. It's more that they were not comfortable with that. I think that anytime you're dealing with other people's money and state and county agencies, there are times when it's not appropriate. For instance, when you're dealing with personnel issues or labor negotiations to some degree. But I do think that in terms of just of transparency, this makes all the sense in the world.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you could suggest that to them, and then we could look in terms of it being an executive session.
I mean, another way to possibly approach it would be to simply ask them for an initial proposal from them. And if they want to put down in writing what their thoughts are, then we could bring that to the board, and the board could discuss it that way in an open meeting. We wouldn't have the benefit of immediate interchange with ODOT over different ideas. But if we wanted to ask them for their initial proposal, we could bring it back, have that conversation, and then go back to them with the thoughts and input from the board. That may be another way to pursue this. Carrie, I don't know if you had thoughts on whether or not they'd be open to that approach. I don't know that that's been specifically discussed.
We have not, other than the correspondence and the options that they have offered in the past, which essentially have been lump sum or some monthly payment arrangement.
And then of course the flip side is true as well, right? We could discuss today a proposal that the commissioners wanted to present to ODOT, and then we could present that to them and then see what their feedback is.
So as far as the back and forth and asking questions about, not just getting a proposal on paper, but asking some questions back and forth, I think there's some value to that. So if they're not comfortable with that, we could perhaps look at what we would ask them to.
Well, and again, I guess on the similar lines, we could take a series of questions back to them. We've done that before. We could take a series of questions to them and ask them to answer them. If the board had some specific information that they were interested in getting from ODOT.
Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. My inclination would be, since they're kind of the creditor, would be to have them, put forth what terms might be acceptable to them, and then we can kind of respond to that. But it seems a little odd that we would put forth those. So if they don't want to come out in an executive session, then maybe that's the route we go. But I think it would be beneficial to have a direct conversation with them too.
Commissioner Kula, thoughts?
I'm happy to invite a first offer from ODOT, and then we can that draft or that proposal can get circulated to us, and then we could either, if Christian thinks that there's a reasonable accommodation for an executive session, I'm happy to have that. It would be desirable, as you noted, Chair, in my opinion, for us to be able to talk directly with them on a back and forth basis, but I understand if that doesn't work.
Okay. All right, so,
But I'm sorry, at the minimum, I'd like to see the ODOT, what do you have in mind? And then come back to us.
right. Or perhaps we ask them for a number of different options they could give us. Not necessarily one, but what would several scenarios look like in that is allowable. So, all right, so that gives us the obligation part of that. The next part are the
Sorry,
options.
Chair.
Yes, go ahead,
One
Commissioner.
thing that we may want to consider is what we would like to see in terms of our fulfilling those obligations, and whether we whether it's just that all of us kind of work on that and discuss individually with Ken and Carrie and Christian what that looks like. But I don't know. I mean, my father always said that the person who brings the first offer to the table loses, but sometimes putting out what our expectations are is a really good way to get started. So I just want to put that out there, that sometimes it's beneficial to us to be the ones to act first.
Okay, thank you for that. Christian, as far as options go, I know that we've all probably had some preliminary discussions about what is allowable at this point, since we do have ownership, and what are some of the options in terms of sale, lease, transfer, just so we know what our options are. And then we can sort of incorporate that into what our goals would be going forward.
You're muted.
Those are all options: sale, lease, transfer, exchange, donation. Those are all options that are open to the board under statute. One thing to keep in mind is that the board acquired this as a corridor, and that's the way that it's listed in our TSP and in our comprehensive plan. So we could hold on to it, and we could lease portions. We could sell the entire corridor in one piece, or one without parceling it up to interested parties. We could transfer it or exchange it with another public entity. So those are all options, and each of those have its own sort of statutory criteria that we would follow. If it was just an outright sale of the corridor as an intact parcel, the most likely scenario would probably be first declaring it surplus, and then following the sheriff's office notice of sale and sale procedures under ORS 275. And again, the board, would want to think about, is this something where you're interested in a potential sale to the public, or is it something where you're more interested in a transfer or an exchange with another public entity? We've done that with tax foreclosed properties before, where we are able, for certain purposes, to transfer property without going through a auction or a sale to municipal corporations, districts, and certain nonprofits. So those are all options. And another option is simply to hold on to it.
Thank you. So now that we know that we do have a number of different options, maybe now we get to the goals part of it. And I'll start with you, Commissioner Kula, if that's okay. What would your goals be for this project, for this piece of property at this point?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I think that maintaining the corridor as one intact tax lot would be my primary goal. And coupled with that is making sure that the county is not on the hook for dramatic expenses that might have to be paid back either through the general fund or through state highway fund allocations. So those are my two, and obviously they go together, right?
Thank you for that. Commissioner Berschauer, your goals.
Thank you, Chair. I think that clearly the money issue where we're triggering repayment of grants is one of my top priorities, but it's unclear to me, and maybe Christian can answer this, but it seems like some of those options that you laid out some of them might trigger repayment of the acquisition grant and some might not. So I think that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. I just feel like I don't have enough information yet to say, well, that makes
Yeah.
sense, but that doesn't.
And I'm sorry, and if you're done, or feel
Yeah,
free
go
to go
ahead.
ahead and finish your other thoughts, and then I can circle back to that if you'd like. Yeah, it'll depend on the direction that the board is interested in going, right? If there is interest in a transfer of the corridor as a intact parcel, and it remains a transportation corridor, that may not trigger repayment of the acquisition grant. That's something that we'd have to discuss with ODOT and discuss with Federal Highways. If it's transferred for reasons that, if it's transferred and there is no intention to continue to use it as a transportation corridor, then I think that's the most likely scenario in which we would be required to pay back the acquisition grant.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers all your questions, or
Yeah, it seems like they're pretty complicated options, but I think for me, I have to get my mind over what we're going to do with the immediate issues with the bridge. Sure. And all those kinds of things. And then we can sort of go, okay, now what?
And I can tell you too, that there's some unique statutory requirements around public entity sales of property adjacent to or that is a rail corridor, right? We have a requirement to provide notice to ODOT at least 30 days before we were to transfer it. And for what purpose, I'm not exactly sure. And the statute describes what it's likely meant to accomplish, which is to give other rail providers an opportunity to at least become aware of the fact that this corridor, that if a private rail provider was interested in purchasing and utilizing for rail purposes, they would be made aware of it. They don't get, as far as I can tell, they don't get sort of preferential treatment. They're not moved to the front of the line, but it's a way to provide notice to those parties to make sure that they're aware that if and when the time comes for a sale, this is a unique piece of property that could potentially be of interest to rail providers. So there's that sort of element to think about. And it's when your property is within 100 feet of a rail corridor or 500 feet, within 500 feet of a rail crossing. And that's exactly where this corridor is. So there's that piece. And when we have conversations with ODOT, we can discuss that requirement with them as well.
Okay. And also, is this a decision that ODOT would make if there were other interested entities, or is that something that the board would decide?
Yeah, the way it looks to me is it's really simply providing them notice that this could be a sale that's coming down the track, for lack of a better term. And like I said, it doesn't give them priority as far as I can tell, but it provides them with the notice so that they can be aware of it. I don't know that it has any additional requirements, and that would fit with the current intended use of the property in our TSP and our comprehensive plan as a transportation corridor. Again, another option that we could talk about is, whether or not the board is interested in approaching ODOT with the idea that they become the owner of the corridor, that we transfer the corridor to ODOT ownership, and then they could, if they decide it fits within their agency purposes and goals, that could be a way to both transfer the property and potentially mitigate some of these financial issues that we're facing, right? And I have no idea. This is simply a topic for conversation. I have no idea if ODOT would be interested in that, or if they would consider that if we were to say, we'll transfer you ownership if you don't pursue repayment of the Connect 6 grant. And then whether there would be additional, terms, that I'm sure there would be. But again, that is something to think about. I just want to throw that out there.
Yes, 1 second, Commissioner. I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. But didn't you already ask ODOT if they wanted the trail and they turned you down?
That was discussed last fall. Yeah.
And they
Yeah,
said
and at
no.
the time they said that they weren't interested. But that was prior to the board actually taking formal action to end the Connect 6 grant. So that may or may not have any impact on their interest in the corridor.
Interesting. Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for asking that. I mean, that was going to be one of my comments. But actually, Christian and Ken and I talked a little bit. The logistics of this might not be simple, but we talked about whether the county could, since it is a corridor, a transportation corridor, we acquired it with funds specifically for a multimodal transportation corridor, and there's a list of purposes of transferring it, creating a county road right of way, I guess would be a way to think about it, out of this parcel. We have this bridge. The bridge, as far as I can tell, I haven't been to the site, so I'm actually just going off of Commissioner Bershauer's photo, I believe. Your photo? Oh, no, not your photo. Okay. The one that you included in the packet. That might be too wide, but I just want to put that out there that we at least talked about that as potentially being an option, is that folding it into the county road right away.
And how do you see that? How do you see that playing out in terms of the funding piece of this?
Yeah, so the county has incurred some of these costs already, right? That haven't been reimbursed. Some of them remain to be reimbursed. But if we are getting a road bridge out of this project that trucks, vehicles, cars, pedestrians can use, that seems like a positive thing for the county's infrastructure, for its road infrastructure. So that was, the thought that I had.
So then you would see this as possibly being a county road through that property?
Yes, and this is just, I'm throwing it out as an option with
Sure.
like a little bit of detail there that obviously we could work on, and we would talk to Director Lago about as well, and the Road Improvement Advisory Committee.
All right, thank you for that. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know really what to say. It seems like we're abandoning the entire point of having a pedestrian bike trail / equestrian / potential commuter rail. So I'm not sure that I don't really understand. Now all of a sudden we're shifting directions drastically for what purpose? And I don't know how the county would actually recoup any money if it's a road. I need some time to wrap my head around that one, because it's just a complete departure from what we've been discussing.
As would transferring ownership to ODOT. So yes, you're right. I believe I've been talking about what our goals are for this piece of property. My goals were to keep the corridor intact for transportation purposes, and to incur the least financial obligation to the county.
Okay, thank you for that. So well, all right, maybe we're doing that cart before the horse thing again, which we like to do in this project. So as far as goals go, I hear that, because I know that I've said before, the county needs to be made whole. The taxpayers need to have the money back that was expended on this to the degree that it's possible. So that should be, in my mind, for me, that's goal number one. I also look at the importance of the neighboring farmers. I look at it as perhaps one of the options is maybe giving them an opportunity to farm more of this property. I don't know. I know that we seem to have this overriding concern about people who want to use their property for a vineyard or to bake bread, and yet when we have a group of farmers who are concerned about farming, we don't see Thousand Friends of Yamhill County concerned about this use of EFU land, which I know it's a transportation corridor, but as far as the conditional use permit, I find there's a disconnect there. But that's an aside. So for me, the goals are to look at the best use for this property after we've paid it back. Now, whether or not we can think in terms of the best use, is it more farming? Is it a road? Does the transportation corridor aspect of that come in? I think those are all worthy of discussion, but we need to know what ODOT's bringing to the table as far as repayment, and then we can be a little more specific in our goals. Commissioner Kula.
I'm sorry, were you done? I just wanted to make sure I was in the queue. Okay. So you think, or one of your goals is to make sure that there's more that farmers adjacent to it, to this tax lot, can farm more land. Would that be an accurate representation?
Well, I would say more land to the degree that it is possible. And I know that we've had the concerns about people worried about the property adjacent to the trail being impacted and how much of their area was impacted because they couldn't spray, they couldn't move equipment, those types of things. So to the degree that that would give them a little bit more breathing room, I think that would be something for us to think about.
Thank you for the clarification. Chair, may I ask Todd a couple of questions then?
Yes, go ahead, Commissioner.
Okay. Councilor Sadlow, what would it look like? Forgive me, Christian, it's just, when we talk about land, I go to Todd. What would it look like? Is it possible to essentially give farmers like an easement for a portion of the tax lot? And would that accomplish the goals, or would it address the concerns that were expressed to us through the conditional use permit process? And then I guess the other one of that would be, during the land use process, we talked about providing access agreements for farmers who have property on both sides. Is that also a possible, legal agreement while still maintaining the right of way or the corridor?
Well, both of those are options that are on the table, Commissioner. I don't know if they want to farm more of it or not, but there certainly are parts of it that were not disturbed by the ballast. We were told we had a survey done, and there's 12 to 20 feet wide of strip of ballast through the corridor on average, and the remainder of it is probably retains the characteristics of the neighboring farm soils.
Okay, great. So at this point, my understanding is that we have an idea what our obligation is as of today. We don't know what ODOT would be willing to present to us, and we have some questions about what that would look like in terms of our obligation. I think, unless I'm misreading everybody, that we need to get an idea of what that is before we can take a look at what our options are. And then looking at our options in light of what we owe, and then also factoring in what our goals are. And we all have, it seems, similar, but there are distinct differences in the goals that we have for this property. But again, making the county whole, the highest and best use for this property, and to try to let this wound heal. That's the way I see it. Commissioner Kula.
I apologize to add to the list of obligations, but another obligation that we have is to finalize some kind of agreement with the Department of the Interior. I think it's Department of the Interior for the parcel that's adjacent to the Wapato Lake National Wildlife Refuge, and then the easement agreement, I believe, across the tax lot. Is that correct, Christian? Are those still outstanding?
Yeah, that's a pretty sort of further down the list issue, but you're right. We've been approached by the refuge. They are still interested in whether or not the county is interested in donating this small little fish hook of a piece of property that we acquired through tax foreclosure right up on the property line in Washington. They have an easement. They're using it at the moment. It's part of the road that accesses a new bridge that they constructed into the refuge. But yes, they have approached us, and they are still interested in whether or not the county would be willing to donate that small piece of land to them. That piece touches the edge of the corridor. And in prior conversations, we have discussed with them the ability to connect from the trail, if it were built in the future, to the Wapato Refuge at that location. And then it seemed like a natural kind of access point. But yes, I've been approached a couple of times this year already by the manager out there. And that's certainly something that if the board wants to tick off an item from the to-do list regarding the trail and these property matters, that would be a pretty quick and easy one. Again, assuming there's an interest in moving forward with that donation. And if there's not, we can tell them that at the moment, there is not that interest there, and then put that on hold for the time being.
Does that impact, Christian, does that impact our obligation in terms of making that commitment to them? And then in light of the fact that we're sort of still in limbo here?
No, it was just one of those serendipitous circumstances where we acquired a trail and we realized that we had, over the course of the years, also acquired this little, it's essentially a portion of a road that we acquired the segment that is just across the county line into Yamhill County. So no, I don't think there's any, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any connection between our grant obligations or our other contractual obligations or our planning for the trail going forward.
Okay, thank you. So are we all in agreement that we'll ask county council and the county administrator to take a look at setting something up with ODOT, giving them whatever input we feel comfortable giving them from each commissioner at this time? And if you don't, I understand. And maybe getting something back from them that we can further discuss. And if it's appropriate, to discuss it in executive session or in a regular formal session.
I will say, I think our best chance might be if we have an initial proposal from them. That gives us something we could discuss in an attorney-client privileged setting in an executive session.
All right. Would they be in agreement if it were an executive session to meet with all of us?
And we can ask them that.
Okay, because we all wanted this to be transparent and we wanted them to be part of this discussion today. That wasn't something they were amenable to, and that's understandable. And maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But that's how they want to do business. And if we can all be on the same page with them in one forum, that'd be great. So if we could get an executive session lined up with that, if they're agreeable to that, letting them know it's not a public forum. And then at least we would have the accountability of making that information available to the public individually and as a board. Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. So Ken, is there some pretty specific avenues for repayment of this grant, in terms of, if it's a lump sum, it sort of has to come out of this account. If it's, monthly payments, then it's a different. Are we restricted in any way?
There's still questions about the interface with the budget, but we did receive, because we're repaying funds that we were reimbursed. We were reimbursed for expenses that went out of Fund 4161. So as a result, and for the documentation trail, any payments back to ODOT or state parks should go through 4161. So then that way it's clearly documented that this is where we incurred the expenses and this is how we're going to repay it. And the part that I mentioned before that is going to require some further action from the board is because 4161, the way it was set up and budgeted, we budgeted expense, but the revenue, it's reimbursement. And so we don't have revenue sources in that fund to cover these expenses. So we're going to need to do a transfer, a movement of funds, whether it's discretionary or one of the other what general fund monies, or if it's one of the other discretionary funds where that we may have funds and appropriation authority, or if we need to do an interfund loan. I mean, we have some options available to move the revenues, but we're going to need to do that pretty quickly. Unlike ODOT, in the termination letter stated that they were open to having repayment discussions, whereas State Parks sent us an invoice for the full amount that I actually need to process because the due date on the invoice is April 3rd. So that is something that I'm going to have to process, and we're going to need to move revenues into 4161 to cover these expenses.
Okay, but just for clarity, all of the options we've been talking about, they have no bearing on the Connect 6 or State Parks grant. I mean, whether we keep it as a corridor or we transfer to somebody, whatever, the Connect 6 is a sunk cost at this point. So we're going to have to deal with that either way. Is that sort of the understanding?
Okay, that's a little bit different question. And if I understand correctly, the question is, no matter what the other discussions, what we're going to do at the corridor, what impact that has on the current grants that we've been given termination notices. They're not connected, but they are. We have a termination notice because right now the county is not pursuing the conditional use permit for the property. We're not, and as a result, we can't proceed with construction of the bridge. If we're not proceeding with the construction of the bridge for the stated purpose that we applied for the grant funds, then there's an obligation to repay that. And the reason I say that there's somewhat of a connection, because depending on what we do with the corridor, if that's a negotiation that happens because it's, as an example, transferred to another agency and they intend to, pursue either trail use or some type of similar use, that could trigger discussions with both ODOT and State Parks. And it's completely up to them on whether or not they would see that if we could complete the bridge and then this transfer that we've satisfied our terms of the agreement. I'm going to look at Christian on some of those. So that's why I'm saying it's a little more complicated on it's connected, but it's not really connected. I mean, right now, the immediate, we do have termination notices on both those grant programs and an invoice in hand requesting repayment on the funds that they reimbursed us for.
Okay.
But as far
That
as
answered your question.
Yeah, as far as the invoice that we've gotten and request for repayment, and there's a due date on it, once again, everything's negotiable, and working with them to say, listen, we're in the process of trying to figure out what's going to be happening. Can you float this for another 30 days? I would think that would not be an unreasonable request. We can ask. Commissioner Kula.
Commissioner Berkshire, I think, is in line behind, in front of me, as it were.
Okay, sorry to have interrupted. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner.
No, that's okay, Chair. You asked my question. It was, if we have a looming deadline for that invoice, do you need board approval to pay that? I mean, I don't know how that works, but it seems like if ODOT is affording us some time to negotiate, maybe we can sort of align the two, if that's a possibility.
We can always ask.
And then, if I might, Chair.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Admittedly, it's under new business, but I do want to note that there is a special district that has expressed interest in acquiring the property, or at least in entering negotiations with the county to acquire the property.
Right,
So
we'll get to that.
They have expressed interest in taking over those obligations as well. So that's why that's a little bit squishy, right?
Right. We'll get to that in a bit, but thank you for the reminder. Thank you. All right. So are we clear on where we're at this point with this item? Anything left in this discussion? Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. Are you talking about number 1A?
Correct.
So last week we were discussing the options of finishing the bridge versus demobilizing. So do we have any additional information on that?
Ken?
Yes. So as was requested, Carrie did reach out to Farline and Dowell and asked for an estimate or a proposal on if Farline were to mobilize, resume construction, and finish the bridge, and what that would look like. And they did provide us an estimate. I don't remember. Carrie, did you send that to the commissioners, or did you only send that to me?
I just sent that to you.
Okay, so I have it, and I will forward it to each of you. And the quote that we were provided, that it also includes, because again, this is a readjustment to finish for them to get it on the schedule, to be on site and finish the construction. The total price that they quoted was $154,615.55.
So if we deduct all of the mobilization, demobilization, all of the impacts, financial impacts to stopping and starting and stopping and starting, where does that, if you subtract that from the 154, how much over would we have been? Have we added up what the mobilization and demobilization costs have been as a result of stopping and starting? Do we have a dollar figure there?
I did not do an analysis to that detail.
Okay, I know that there's over just the eyeball of the 56,000 each time there was a mobilization. That was on there twice. That's $56,000 twice that I noticed. And there were other charges associated. So we know it is significant. So if I'm wondering if what that dollar figure would look like if you took those mobilization and demobilization costs out. How much more would this cost beyond what we were allocated and beyond what they bid the project for?
I would say in conversations that I've had that if the project as planned would have been started and completed, we were on pace for our budgeted amount. The complicating factors that come into play, because this is a contractor that has bridging projects scheduled all over so if there's a delay in a project or a shutdown on a project, you're going to incur these mobilization costs, and it's really because they can't just leave their equipment there on site and just shut down, and then with the staging of materials and everything. And so if you're removing things and demobilizing from the site and then moving everything back in, I mean, that's one of the difficult parts. The first answer is, if this was your typical project, that they would have been able to get on site, construct the bridge, and they were on pace and on timeline and on budget to complete it to what was originally spec'd out.
So the 154,000 at this point is really to play catch up, and that's not including the mobilization, the other stuff we've also been invoiced for, which is those two, mobilization, demobilization.
And we've already been invoiced, and part of the latest invoice that we have includes those mobilization and also some additional cost with the with the challenges, because we had that in particular, because they had a large piece of equipment that was on the other side of the creek. And they got it over there by building a temporary bridge to move the equipment to do work on that side of the creek. And then when they were getting ready to set the beams in place to set the main stringers into place, of course, they dismantled the temporary bridge in order to set, because they used the same abutments for the temporary bridge. So in order to get across. And so we also incurred some additional costs for there, because that piece of equipment was essentially on an island to a certain degree, and we weren't able to, again, which would have been, there would have been expense associated with either way. We were able to work with one of the neighboring property owners to get the equipment out. So there was that incurred cost for being able to get that equipment out. So I don't know if I answered your question or if I'm just sharing more than.
No, go ahead, Commissioner Bershauer. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Chair. So what have we spent, so what have we invoiced or paid Farline for the actual construction to date?
What I have to date on my records, which includes the invoice that is on my desk right now for payment, all total, that'll be at $564,451.
So
$564,451.03.
And then, Ken, to clarify, that includes whatever mobilization, demobilization costs have been incurred by Farline since last summer when the first stay was put in place.
Correct.
Yeah.
So the calculations, I mean, for another $155,000 to finish it, that's 30% of the overall budget if you're adding the two together. So it's concerning to me that we were told that this thing was, that the grant was 95% complete, meaning the funds available for construction were 95% consumed, if you will, and yet we have another 30% of construction costs looming out there.
Well, again, I would just point out that the original budget did not anticipate a shutdown and a restart with mobilization, demobilization, and moving the equipment out. And also the latest invoice that we do have also has some closeout items that I believe may be part of, but not a significant amount, but some of the invoice that I have now is some closeout that we would pay in a lump sum at the end of the contract. So there's a number of items in the current contract that I believe there may be some overlap with the proposal, but I would need to confirm that.
So we knew that they were going over budget. What's in the contract to state what is to be done if the construction costs exceed the grant funds?
Well, they weren't over budget, were they?
To the extent that's a question to me, yeah, I think what Ken was describing is that when the first stop occurred last summer, they were on time and on budget, and we didn't have any indication at that time that they would go over budget. What I think is driving these added costs, at least in part, if not primarily, is likely to be the stopping, restarting, moving equipment in and out, reassigning equipment to other places, expenses that were a direct result of the fact that we were ordered by LUBA to stop. And I don't know if it's possible, Ken or Carrie, to go back and figure out an exact number as to where we were in terms of work performed, amounts paid, and funding left on the day the first stay came down, and then sort of look and see the costs that have been incurred since then and break out costs that are specifically associated with the stopping and the restarting as opposed to underlying construction. I don't know if that's possible. That may help resolve some of the questions that I think I'm hearing the board ask.
We have itemized, these invoices are pretty specific, and we do have itemizations that are labeled mobilization, traffic control. So a variety of things that point to it being a result of the LUBA stays. That should be fairly easy for us to pull those out to get an idea whether or not we were on target. But if we were on target except for the stop and start costs, then that should tell us something. But I would think that'd be something that, since they have itemized everything, that would tell us whether we were on.
And I would highlight also, it's beyond just the mobilization, there was also some incurred costs because, I mean, we had, well, two of the stringers that have been at the supplier, you know, there's some costs in storing materials that were also part of that as well. So I just wanted to, it's not just the start and stop, but then it's also the ongoing. When you're in a stop position, there still is some percentage of cost associated with that.
And then I think, just to get back to Commissioner Bursauer's initial question, which is what are the mechanisms under the contract to deal with increases in cost? We do have provisions in there that if there are changes in the overall cost of the project, those would be discussed and negotiated, and there would be a change order that would have to come from the contractor that would reflect the added cost or the change in conditions on site. So I don't think we've seen any change orders yet. Carrie or Ken can correct me, because I'm not sure at this point whether we've actually exceeded the budgetary the total cost yet.
I believe that with right now, depending on, that's part of the discussions, because with the two proposals that we have in hand right now, with finishing construction versus, and what I'm going to divide out, you know, that a decommissioning, which means if we're going to ask Farline under the options that they presented, if they're either going to finish constructing the bridge, or if we're going to ask for them to remove the abutments, restore it back to pre-construction status, that is going to be that conversation that's going to be part of that change order. But up to this point, we're still within the contract's budget, depending on what is decided on how we're going to proceed. And then that would require that discussion around the change order for the additional incurred costs that they've presented to us.
Commissioner Burschauer.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my point is that, you know, you guys knew this was happening as of last summer in terms of the delays, and that the delays would have costs, right, associated with them. So it should have been discussed that if we exceed the amount of the grant, what is going to happen to trying to finish the bridge? Was that discussion had, and what was the game plan for covering these costs that exceeded the grant?
To be honest, I mean, at that point, what discussions, I mean, there was a lot of unknowns and questions. We were waiting for how many months for a LUBA decision. At the time, we were in a holding pattern. And so being able to come back and have a discussion on what the costs are going to be when we're still pending decisions from LUBA or the next steps in the project, you know, being able to have a substantive discussion and have data to be able to answer all these questions when, again, we were still faced with the unknown. We weren't clear where LUBA was going to come down or where the next steps in the project. And at that point, you know, it would have looked similar to where we're at right now with these discussions on what are we going to do with the bridge? What are the plans? Are we going to finish construction? What is the cost going to look like to finish construction versus, okay, we're not going to proceed with this. What is the plans? What are we going to do with the site, and what costs are we going to incur? And so now we're able to gather that information and have that. But at this point, last summer and into the fall, we were all pending decisions. And, you know, so the timing of whether or not what actions were going to need to be taken under that contract at that time. We do know that with the second demobilization that there was going to be some incurred costs associated with that. But at that point, it wasn't enough to necessarily have a full picture to necessitate starting a discussion about a change order for a contract on a project that we weren't sure what the next step was going to be.
Thank you. Commissioner Kula.
Was I in the queue?
I thought you raised your hand, yes?
Well, I don't believe I did, but did want to ask if Ken wanted to. I mean, I think there's the lingering question which we have addressed in the past, but if it's not fully addressed, it needs to be fully addressed, which is the question about 30% more to finish construction of the bridge versus comments about 95% of the money going out on the grant. And it seems like it might be wise for you to kind of re-summarize that, if you could, Ken.
Thank you.
Just putting you on the spot.
Right, you know, and again, with the analysis that we had, you know, where I really go back to, you know, this project experienced delays based on decisions and the stay that was issued. And at that point, we were on pace to finish the project, the bridge construction, on time and under budget. Keeping in mind that the bridge construction at the Stag Hollow Creek is one element of the overall grant. We still had the engineering, design, permitting, and the construction management portion of it with Dowell that was really the largest part of the grant in total. In fact, more than half of the total grant amount was that. We did get designs on the bridge. We did get designs on the other crossings. All that work did take place as part of this project through the timeline. And, you know, there's still costs associated with, depending on the decision to where we go, because again, Dowell has been contracted to oversee the construction of the bridge and manage the construction site. So we still have those costs associated with that. And those are also incorporated in the estimate for completing the bridge in the proposal that was presented. So, you know, I'm not sure if I'm answering that question, but there are, you know, there were elements of the grant that we were successful, that we met the requirements and benchmarks within there. We completed the design work, we did the environmental, we had, you know, the resources out on the site to prepare everything for construction and present plans throughout the project. And, you know, what we're really down to, it was the bridge construction at this point. And we did incur the stoppages and starting and the stop, and then to remobilize again one more time, you know, that's an additional cost that were not anticipated when we prepared the initial budget or the grant proposal.
Commissioner Kula. Thank you, Ken.
Well, I had a follow-up question, but it looks like Christian may want to add.
No, I mean, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I guess thank you for explaining that in more detail. So we have 154, 615 to complete the bridge. And some of those expenses in there are ones that we're going to incur. They're like a base expense, essentially, for this versus mothballing versus clean slate, I guess, for lack of a better word. Ken, do you have those numbers of clean slate and mothball too? Which I guess mothball would be just putting it to sleep, and then clean slate would be taking out the concrete, replanting it to natives.
Yes, I believe if I'm reviewing it correctly, and I'm going to look at Carrie. Carrie, feel free to jump in here and correct me if I'm mistaken. But the latest invoice, if we were to just stop and not do anything further other than some plantings and some erosion, you know, whatever else that we need to do to make a status. So if we're leaving the abutments in place, and you know, a lot of that was included in the final invoice, but we still have to, we're going to incur some costs because we still have two of the main stringers that are on the site that I don't believe we should just leave on the site in the current condition. So there will be some demobilization. We'll need to move that out. And then we also have, because there was a total of 4 stringers, I believe, and then some other rails that we have that are staged elsewhere, that we would have to come up with a plan. So that was included in some of the further decommissioning. And if I remember, I'm grabbing it here really quickly.
If I can add to that, Farline did provide us with 2 options, and that's probably what Ken's looking for right now. On February 16th, we had asked them, actually several options, 4 options. We asked them to tell us what would it cost to do one of the following, whether that was everything from just basic decommissioning of the site to pre-construction condition. And so that's the memo that they provided. Do you have a copy of that? Because I can send that to everyone.
I believe I did send that one, but not, if you want to send it again,
Sure.
Kara, that'd be great.
Yep.
So I found it. So option 1, which again is to remove the 2 slabs that are currently on site, remove the other 2 slabs that are still at the vendor who made the slabs, and taking those to a county yard, hauling the bridge rail to a county yard, getting the cranes in to move the equipment. That was $73,000 under option 1. And then Farline did present, like we had discussed last week, that option 1 with an alternative is where they did offer a buyback, an offer to buy back at 80% of the value of it. So it'd be the 73,000, but there would be a 71,000 buyback of those materials.
Here, if I may, it seems like with what Farline is offering for a buyback of materials on hand, it seems like there's, you know, for pilings and beams, and then for also just the basic materials, that number exceeds what they have quoted us to decommission the site. So potentially could be a net positive for the county in terms of recouping costs, as opposed to 155,000 or whatever to finish it. So as well as the current invoice, which is $41,000 some. So that's actually a bigger number. It seems like a no-brainer to me. You know, I'm not going to sign up to cost county taxpayers another $200,000, but I'll go back to my point, which last week, which is the entire point of this bridge was to be fashioned to accommodate the trail. And we have been very clear now about the county's direction on the trail. So I don't see how we can go forward and complete the bridge.
The only part that I didn't finish was on the option 2 and 3, which again, I still think that there's going to have to be some discussion on it, because there is whether or not what we're doing with the concrete abutments and the steel pilings that were driven in out of the site, on how what we're going to do with those, and whether or not we're just going to leave them as is, or I'm not even sure if we've even got an answer from through our permitting contacts, if that's if we can leave them as is, as you know, the abutments in place. But the option 2 was option 1 or option 1A, which includes, that's the demobilization and the buyback. But if we were to remove and dispose of the concrete abutments, that's 37,500. And then to do remove and dispose of the steel pilings, is another 8,500. So there's some other elements, and I just want to make sure that I was able to get through the whole invoice and realize that you have option 1, and then you have an option 1 with an alternate if we're going to do the sellback exercise, the sellback on the materials. But then there's also what we do with the concrete abutments and then the steel pilings.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Ken. Christian?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify. I believe when we're talking numbers too, that in addition to the quote we've gotten from Farline to complete the bridge construction work, if it were decided to go forward with completion, there would also be some additional costs from Dowell for their construction management and oversight. Those costs are not fully incorporated into Farline's proposal. Is that right?
That is incorrect. They are included in that proposal.
Oh, okay. That's what I wanted to clarify, because that's what I
Yes.
thought I heard Ken say.
Yes.
And I just wanted to make sure we were talking apples to apples, that any of the Dowell outstanding costs are incorporated in this 154 number.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Yeah.
All right.
Perfect.
So, no, I just think that this is good information, but again, we can't make any decisions, I would think, until we have a determination on what we'd like to see happen there. So whether or not the bridge would be sort of a moot point, or whether or not it would actually function in whatever capacity it winds up being. So again, this is one of those things, until we know what we'd like to see happen there, and that's the other discussion when we get to goals. Commissioner Kula, did you want to weigh in on that? Do I have consensus on that we are discussing this, but we can't make any determinations, I would imagine, until we've decided, okay, what's the next step for this piece of property?
Yes, I think you're right, Chair, or at least that's how I'm seeing it.
So are there any, Commissioner Berschauer?
Thank you, Chair. Can we get a complete list from Farline for what they have offered to buy back? Because I want to say that I'm seeing the slabs and the rail and the 80% buyback at 71,000, but I thought that they had also offered for the pilings and some of the materials on hand. So there was an additional offer. So if we could just clarify with them, that would be good.
And Chair, if I may, to add to Commissioner Berschauer's comments, I believe one of the items is $2,000 to truck it to a county yard. If buyback, that would eliminate that number. So I think it'd be good to get some more details here.
Thank you. Appreciate that. All right. Are we ready to move on to the next discussion? Do we have any more questions? Are we ready to move on to the next discussion on our agenda regarding the request for a, where are we?
Chair, before we move on to that sub point, we do have, and I don't know whether the timing, how urgent it is. I think there's some level of urgency from Ken's perspective on getting consensus around expending money on maintenance costs or replanting. What's the timing? No, okay, scratch that.
No, thank you, Commissioner. I think I feel pretty comfortable with what we discussed last week, and just having the discussion and recognizing that we still own the corridor and they have some work to do, some maintenance work. As far as the plantings that need to occur at the specific construction site, that is something that that's part of these discussions around what we're doing with Farline, because it's actually part of that Farline would go out and do the plantings that need to occur. I mean, they've already purchased the materials, and we're looking for the green light to go in and start doing those plantings. But otherwise, you know, so that portion of it is tied to what we need to do for next steps with Far Lines with that agreement on the bridge construction. As far as the maintenance goes, I feel like there was already pretty good consensus, or at least the discussion and recognizing that we have some work that we still need to be able to do in the corridor.
And I think that was a county expense all along, that the county had been to some degree maintaining some of the right of way. Are we ready to move on to the discussion of a proposed audit? Commissioner Bershauer, do you want to explain your submission here?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I have made a formal request for a forensic audit of the Connect 6 grant and expenditures related to the construction of the bridge. I've had several folks who live in the county who are taxpayers and residents that are very concerned about the fact that we have spent over $1 million on something that looks the way it does. And I sent you all a picture of the current status of the bridge. And I think that based on their concerns, as well as some of I went over a couple of the invoices from Farline, and there's a lot of questions that are not answered in terms of what we're being charged for and the work that has not been done. So I believe at this point it warrants an audit, and I think it should be an external audit. And I'm not sure what the process is for getting that lined up, but one of my questions is, who was actually the project manager on this? Who was the person that was out there, you know, vetting the work and looking at invoices and making sure that the deliverables were coming in and we're being charged for what we were supposed to be charged for?
And
That Dowell.
Chair, if I may, it sounds like maybe it would be good to just go over the whole process of work being done, who saw it, invoicing for that, who oversees all the invoices, kind of the whole process. If you're amenable to that, Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioner Kula. I'm not sure I understand. What I'm seeking is a forensic audit to where we could have the costs incurred parallel to the work that was delivered, to make sure that we understand what was happening and what was being expended, because now we have this end product that looks nothing like it should. So that's my goal for the audit.
Okay, so this was a clarification, not for the audit, but specifically for your question around a project manager. It seems like it might be helpful to have an explanation of the process of getting from a scope of work and contract to a pouring of a slab at a yard to the state of Oregon reimbursing us. And so that's just my request as part of your conversation.
Thank you. And Ken was explaining this yesterday. We had a meeting and you were explaining basically the project manager concept of Dowell and then how it went through this sort of chain here at the county. So yes, that would be helpful. Thank you.
So I'd be happy to explain that. So this is a grant funded project. And so how it was set up is the first element was, of course, because again, like I was saying earlier, this project was more, and the grant funds was a lot more than just the construction of this single bridge. This was design and all of the elements leading up to the construction of the bridge, and then overseeing the construction. So the grant was approved. We did an RFP process, or it was a qualification based invitation to bid on the process. I'll let Christian, if you have questions about that, Christian can get into details about the differences in the processes. But so long story short, OBEC, at the time they were OBEC, but then they merged with Dal, so it's now Dal. Dal was hired under contract to do the design, permitting, and get us through the entire process, and then provide construction management to oversee the construction of the bridge. once they were in place and they finished all their design work, then we also did an RFP, or an invitation to bid, an ITB, which requires you go with low bid. We went through that process. Farline Construction was selected to build the bridge. Once construction started, and there's different elements associated with this, as construction was going, any invoices and the work plans were through Dal. Dal would do a review of the invoices and look at the benchmark, look at what is being invoiced. They were available for questions because, again, it was their design that the contractor was implementing. So as far as the oversight and review process, we had both, because we have obligations, because we have to report to ODOT on progress on the grant. And then we've hired Dal to oversee the construction of the bridge. And then Farline also, had direct, obviously, oversight in actually building the bridge. So sometimes it's easier to explain the process. So they finish a portion of a project, or they have, they're ready to submit an invoice to the county. They submit the invoice to Dal. Our contacted Dal does their review of the invoice. They send it to Carrie Martin and say, this one's ready to go. Carrie Martin would then review the invoice and prepare the reimbursement request to get that submitted to ODOT. And then at the same time, that same invoice would be routed to me, because I have signature authority in order to release payment from county budget. So I would review the invoice as well. And then once I signed off on it, accounting would release the check to the contractor. And then Carrie would submit the invoices and the reimbursement request to ODOT, who then also have their own review process, because we have a designated contact under the grant program that also reviews the eligibility of the expenses that we're claiming, and doing that and looking at the grant requirements. And so they're also doing their own internal review and then going through their process to prepare for the reimbursement requests and send the check to us.
Great, thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you. So does this bring us into, before we move into the next part of this discussion regarding a request for a forensic interview, Commissioner Berschauer, does any of that allay your concerns about the invoicing and change your opinion about whether or not there would be a need for an external forensic audit?
Thank you, Chair. It's helpful, but I don't think it answers my questions. I mean, when I looked at the latest invoice, what was discussed during the BOC meeting was that Farline needed to get some equipment out of that site, right? So they went back out there in February, maybe it was the end of February, and removed equipment. But the invoice does not reflect that. There's questions about the invoice in terms of mobilization cost, constructing and removing an access road. As far as I know, there's been no access road that's been needed in terms of getting to their equipment. We're talking about embankment, purchasing, seeding and plant cuttings and all of these things that we're being billed for, but that's not what's being done. And so there might be a good explanation for it. I'm not sure. But at the end of the day, we have a very incomplete bridge, and we've spent over $1 million. And I think that we owe it to the taxpayers to make sure that everyone's very clear about how we got to this point. And I'm not a forensic auditor, so I think that work, and as far as I know, none of us are. So I think that work is best done externally.
Ken, thank you, Commissioner.
I just wanted to clarify, because we understand that, Commissioner, that you had specific questions around the invoice, and we did reach out to Dal, and they did prepare a summary, explanation on some of those specific questions that you did have. And there were a number of items that, like one, the mobilization that with some of the work, like I explained earlier about the excavator and the additional steps that they had to go through to demobilize or move that equipment out, it wasn't as simple as just driving that piece of equipment out. We hadn't been billed to date for that work that occurred. And so that was included in the invoice. The temporary work zone, traffic control, the construction and removal of the access road, the erosion control, a number of those items are lump sum payments that would have been due at the end of the contract that have not been billed yet. And so that's why those specific items were included in this latest invoice. Let me see. So a lot of those specific questions we did get answers to, and I'm happy to forward those. We got them late in the day yesterday, and so we can share that information that we received from Dell.
So did they answer questions such as $800 for a health and safety plan? If we were to take a look at various items that jump out at us, $800 for a health and safety plan, $800 work containment plan. Just again, a question.
I don't think we asked those specific questions, but we could ask that specific question and get some clarification on what's involved with that expense.
So what if we started with sitting down with Dowell and asking some specific questions that we had, and then coming back, and if those questions we'd been satisfied with the answers and the explanations and perhaps some supplemental documentation, then maybe Commissioner Bershauer, we wouldn't have a need for an external forensic audit, but that would be determined by, did we get enough information talking to the project manager? Just a suggestion.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's possible. My concern is that, and I understand how construction companies build and how these things go and what's part of the bid process. But just because it's part of the bid process and part of the deliverables doesn't mean you invoice it for the sake of invoicing and then it's not delivered. So my concern is that a lot of this stuff is not actually appearing on the ground on the trail. And so that's where the questions start to come in. And we've already, with this last invoice, we are now butting up to the entirety of the grant funds. So it's a concern, especially since we got another invoice or a proposal saying it's going to cost another $155 grand to finish the bridge. So we can start there. I think that's reasonable, but I don't know how that looks in terms of which commissioners are part of that discussion or not, but I certainly would like to be a part of it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for suggesting that, Chair. I think that's a good starting point, is to go through items that are of concern to Commissioner Bershauer. But I would also be interested and get answers as best Dowell can answer, or Farline. But I think might be interesting to know, is there anything that Farline has billed the county for that there's no either physical object that has been created with labor, so materials materials and personnel. Is there anything that's doesn't exist that can be traced to that, or that's on their site pending delivery to the site, such as the seeding and the cuttings? And then I guess the other part of that is, as Commissioner Bershauer has alluded to multiple times, she knows a lot about construction. There's probably some profit in here, I'm assuming. Can we go over kind of how, I want to make sure that Farline is getting paid enough by this process too. And then I guess the third component of that is that I think it behooves us to stop talking about butting up against grant totals, because there's not really a grant anymore in our world. There's just the money that that was granted to us on a reimbursement basis. We're in violation of that contract right now. So this is a bridge building exercise of our own at the moment.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Bershauer.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner Cool, I'd say in response to that, that typically when you bid a job, your bid is all encompassing. So if you have overages, typically they're not negotiated. You eat that cost, which reduces your profit. So I'm not sure if this is different, but that's how it typically goes in the private sector. But what I will say in response to the grant issue is that, yes, it was communicated to the public that the Connect 6 grant and the Parks grant combined were for the construction and design of this bridge and the 2 culverts. And there was not any discussion about how it might cost us more money or there might be more grants involved. In fact, that only came through when we had our meeting in February to discuss the future of the trail. So I just wanted to make that clear.
And to clarify, Commissioner Bershauer, there were conversations about whether there was enough money in the Connect 6 grant to cover the cost of this, which is why we had the OPRD grant as well. Just to put a point on there, the county did not pursue any other grants to fund the potential cost overruns of this. And I think it was in part because we were pretty stalled in the construction because of the LUBA stay. But I have the 2 questions are pending, I think, with county staff.
Ken?
What were the I'm sorry, Commissioner, what were the questions that we were pending?
Yeah, so the question number 1 is there anything that can't be physically accounted for, whether it's in time or materials in the project?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Commissioner Bershauer.
I guess I'm confused about Commissioner Kula's question, because when you submit a bid, your profit or any of those margins are included in the bid. You're not simply bidding for the material costs of the bridge. So can you give me some more clarification on what you're after there?
You know, I asked that to make sure that we were accounting for all the costs, because I think that's your concern, right? Is accounting for all the costs. So the question was directed at staff. That was question number 2, I believe, of 3. The first question was, is there anything that's not accounted for, that's not physically there, or that hasn't been labor to do that work? Because that was your concern as expressed. And then the second one was, is there a separate profit, or is it built into those costs?
And the part that I would just, again, emphasize that, you know, the challenges for a contractor and the delays associated, and keeping in mind, you know, this is a company that we not only, you know, it is specific to this bridge project, but has also bid on and has worked on other bridging projects with Public Works and, you know, like a number of other contractors that we work with. And they incurred costs due to the nature of the actions that have occurred during the land use process. That was not a fault of the contractor. You know, like I was saying before, when we started this project and work began, it was on pace, on schedule, on budget to be completed. And with the stay that was imposed, you know, that's not something that I mean, holding a contractor, well, you need to, because of this other action that occurred, they were going to incur expenses in shutting down, demobilizing, and then shifting their resources to another project, or, you know, whatever their work schedule was looking like. And so there was an impact there. And then restarting the project and attempting to not only work with the county and getting the project done, but then we were also as a county trying to meet the timeline considerations under the grant agreement as well. So that, you know, there was pressure to meet those timelines, and Farline remobilized to the site. They didn't, you know, they didn't say, well, we don't have you on the schedule, we'll see you, so they made those adjustments, but we were going to incur, they were going to incur some costs that is in no fault to the contractor. I mean, that was a mobilization, remobilization, trying to work with the customer and get the project done. And then when the second delay happened, and then the timing that it took before we even had a decision from LUBA, it was essentially in a holding pattern for quite some time. So I just wanted to, again, just kind of echo some of the challenges that we had, and just recognize that, the contractor, Farline, which we have a really good history with of working with on other projects. And the same thing goes with our relationship with Dowell, that there was nothing that came up through this process that was raising any type of flags with staff. We were seeing it. We have a good partnership. There were delays that were even outside of our control, as far as decisions from LUBA, and then the ultimate decision to not proceed with the conditional use permit. And that put us into the situation right now. And I just wanted to add that information.
I want to just, again, the information, if we had more specifics and a conversation with Dowell to look at the dollar figure of what all of and I know a lot of them are going to be hard to extricate, but the dollar amount of mobilization, demobilization, and some of those stops and starts. But irrespective of that, if I'm hearing right, Commissioner Bershauer is expressing concern about, or questions about, the items or the progress, and requesting an audit to include those questions. So I'm thinking that, again, if it's amenable, that we do have questions. We are going to make allowances for the mobilization and demobilization costs. That we understand. But aside from that, if there are still questions regarding the progress of the trail, the amount of money spent, taken into account, we've stopped and started, that maybe Dowell can answer some of those questions. We can be more specific with the detailed questions we have about what's a health and safety plan for $800, what's a work containment plan, so that maybe there is a little bit more scrutiny before we look at an external forensic audit, which will incur more money, but I don't know that it's not warranted. So I'm not saying it's not warranted. I'm saying I have questions too. But maybe we start with them and then go from there and make a decision on looking further into it. Commissioner Bershauer, does that make sense at this point?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Chair. And I would be agreeable to that path.
Okay, so do you want to have those discussions with Dowell, or how does staff recommend that we have those discussions?
We will reach out to Dowell, and in the meantime, we will also share with the board the responses that we had to those specific questions about that latest invoice. We will share that information, and we'll reach out and have the conversation with Dowell, and then we can circle back with the board.
Okay, Commissioner Bershauer, you wanted to be part of that, or is that premature? You'll have your conversation with them first, Ken, and then if Commissioner Bershauer has questions, maybe she can join in on a phone call or a Zoom call. Anybody?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I haven't seen the response. I had a list of questions and I haven't seen a response. So I think we should just start from there. And if Ken wants to reach out to them and see if they're willing to sit down, great. But I haven't seen any responses yet, so.
Okay. All right. So let's start there and continue that discussion, get a little more detail, and see where we go from here. Commissioner Kula.
Yes, and thank you, Chair. If a conversation then proceeds that Commissioner Bershauer wants to talk directly with Dowell, perhaps with staff available, I think it would be great to have that conversation recorded so that I can listen in. for just for full transparency.
All right. So Christian, as far as process there would be information we'd all like to have. I want to make sure that we get whatever information is forthcoming from that, and whether it's a relaying it, staff relaying it, or
Is that a specific question to me about how we go about having those conversations or discussions?
well, we have one commissioner who's requested information to actually be involved in those conversations. We have another
Right.
commissioner who's asked that that information be available to the board. How would you suggest we?
If I may,
However the board chooses to proceed. I mean, if you would like, if you're in agreement that you want that conversation or that phone call recorded, we can talk with OBEC about recording that conversation.
if I may, as just kind of a path going forward, I would like the opportunity for staff to reach out and just have the initial conversation. We can share the information that we've received to date. I would like to have the initial conversation with Dal, and then I can circle back with the board. And if it results in a larger meeting or an invitation or something more substantial, then I can circle back with the commissioners at that time.
That sounds agreeable. Everybody, does that work for an initial discussion?
That certainly works.
Commissioner Bershauer?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, and I can follow up with responses to whatever information comes my way too in the interim. So.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Yeah, because I would like to emphasize that, again, if any commissioner has any questions about any elements of any of the information that you have and you want us to pose those questions, we will present those questions to Dell, to Farline, to ODOT, to state parks, whoever, whatever the nature of the questions are, we will follow up on those questions and get answers.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. Thank you for the discussion. Are we ready to move on to our department updates, which we have none, in a consent agenda?
Yes, please, Chair. I would move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
We have a motion to approve the consent agenda. Further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion passes. On to land use, which is item 3, consideration of a request for formal acknowledgement of the applicant. Would that be considered under the consent agenda? It is consent agenda. Okay, saw those words land use pop out, and okay, we'll move on to old business. We have
Chair, if I may, I had the same thought. Thank you.
I wanted to make double sure. Where are we? We're on to I, other business, and that's consideration of approval of Chehalem Park and Recreation District's proposal to acquire the Yamhill Westsider Trail tax lot from Yamhill County. So we've received a letter from Chehalem Parks and Recreation, and my understanding from the letter is that they have an interest in either buying or leasing the right-of-way to include in their strategic plan for their trail system. So Commissioner Kula, do you understand that what they're asking is that we sell or lease the right-of-way to them?
I believe, Chair, that thank you. I believe that the request, and we have one of the board of directors coming on, but is to elicit interest from the county commissioners to begin some kind of negotiation over that. I was approached by CPRD staff with the question about that, and I explained as best I could the process. And it looks like we have Lisa Rogers here to give us more details. So if Chair, if you are interested, I believe that Lisa can share.
Okay, Commissioner Bershauer, yes.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a little bit of concern that we're discussing these in detail because I think that the board has not indicated what direction we want to go. So I feel like this is a little premature. I mean, it's nice to know that there's interest. I'm not sure I'm ready to have this discussion because we have not decided on a direction yet.
Thank you,
certainly.
Lisa. Thank you, Lisa, for being with us. I appreciate that. So Christian, I just wanted to go back to process again. And in a situation like this where we haven't determined, there's no consensus on what the next step is. Is it appropriate? Are we following the order of things to have an entity that's interested in this, or is this perhaps something that's an RFI or a RFQ, just so that we don't get, because for instance, would we have had Farline make a presentation before we had sent out a request for proposals? I just want to make sure before we get started in any discussion that we're not, again, cart before the horse.
No, because someone could make this sort of proposal as part of public comment. Any of the commissioners could choose to bring this sort of an issue forward, place it on the agenda. This is simply a informational proposal. The board's not making any decisions. As Commissioner Berschauer and you, Madam Chair, have pointed out, the county hasn't made decisions about how they're going to proceed. If you decide that this is premature, then you could propose to wait and have this conversation later, after the board has given, gotten answers to some of its questions and has a clearer sense of the direction it's going. That would certainly be appropriate as well. So it's really up to the discretion of the board. If you feel like you're ready to hear this presentation now, you can hear it. If you'd rather wait, you can do that as well.
Commissioner Kula.
I just wanted to second Christian's comments, as that it's entirely up to a majority of the board whether they would like to hear from Lisa Rogers in her role as an elected board chair or a board member for Chehalis Parks and Rec.
Thank you. I appreciate your being here, Lisa. The only thing I want to make sure is that we are not, again, this board has made no decision on direction. And no decision has been made, and there's a lot to be considered, obligation, the goals. And so I want to respect your interest in this, but I also don't want to put this perhaps in a pole position that's not appropriate. So I want to give you an opportunity to maybe just give us a brief statement about your interest without necessarily getting into any specifics, so we don't get into that murky area. Thank you for being with us, Lisa.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Yes, I think that the reason that we are here today is just to make sure that depending on when you do make a decision, if the decision is such that you are not going to move forward with the trails, that a consideration would be made to have a conversation with CPRD, so that we could see whether or not it would be something that we could take on if you were unable to do so. And we are, trails in our community have always been the number one item that people have identified as a resource that they would like in their community. And CPRD has quite a bit of experience developing these trails so far in the Newburgh-Dundee area. And it is just with that in mind that we would like to make sure that if there is a decision that you are not going to move forward, to please consider reaching out to us and letting us know whether or not there is an opportunity for us to have a further discussion on what it would look like in the future.
Fair enough. And I appreciate the information. I appreciate the letter of interest, and Commissioner Kula for bringing this forward. And so again, we're still sort of in the nascent stages of trying to figure out our next steps, and we have some information to gather, and we'll just take this into consideration and make decisions according, knowing that there is interest from CPRD.
Thank you so much, Commissioner.
Commissioners, do you have any questions for Lisa before Lisa leaves us?
No, I appreciate Lisa joining us, Chair, and thank you for giving her the opportunity to just say a few words. Now we have that document in front of us, and as she said, we know that they have interest. I wanted to make sure this was very, very public.
Okay, thank you. Okay, good deal. Commissioner Berschauer.
Chair, I just have one quick question for Lisa. I have your letter in front of me. And it's pretty clear that you're proposing to purchase or lease the trail, one of the two options. So is that something that's been approved by your board? That's the ask?
It has not been approved by the board to actually buy or lease yet. We have a board meeting this evening where we were going to have further conversation about this, but and it's all premature. So it's really hard for us to come to any kind of decision until you all have come to some kind of a decision. I think it would really be more how could we work with you? What is the best way to work with you to make sure that trails are still part of something that we can offer to the broader community that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, no other questions? Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Thank you. All right, so we will move on to other business, item I2, which is discussion of priorities and plans for effective use of American Rescue Plan funds. It's kind of like winning the lottery. You win the lottery and all of a sudden everybody remembers that you're a relative. So we've got Ken Huffer here, who once again is in the hot seat because he's got to figure out who, what, where, how, and what are the restrictions on the funds.
And Chair, if I might, I asked Ken to put this on the agenda, not to overload Ken, but to get to get the
unoverloadable.
I don't know. I mean, no, I'm not going to say anything more. But I do feel like it's important for us as a board to engage with our staff around this issue. There are both internal needs, internal to the county operations, and also external to the county that could stand to benefit from funding. And so I want to make sure that we have opened up that discussion and provided staff the opportunity to look at things, look at the eligibility requirements or restrictions before we, just so we get the conversation started. And with that, I'll turn it over either to Ken or to Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. I think we have so little information now that once again, here we are in a fact-finding time of this. This just came to us, and I know it's been frustrating for our administrator to try to get some specifics, and they are not forthcoming from Treasury from what I understand. But Ken, what do we know so far?
Yes, thank you, commissioners. And, and I do think it's going to be important that I think there's a lot of need and there's a lot of question marks, and there, it's pretty common knowledge that there's a pretty substantial amount of funding that's going to be directly allocated to Yamhill County straight from the U.S. Treasury as part of the American Rescue Plan Act. The figure is almost 21 million, so it's $20.77 million. And I'll just share some of the information that I have at this point. And I know I've shared this before, and I apologize if it's, but I just think it's important to get the reminder out there. So again, this 20 million is going to be distributed directly from the U.S. Treasury to the county. 50%, the first allocation is going to be right around 50% of the total allocation, and that is supposed to occur within 60 days of the final approval of the act. And the President Biden signed that, I believe, on March 11th. And so we're looking at on or before May 10th, we should see the first distribution of funds. So there's some preliminary analysis that has been done. I've been following both through NACO and AOC, and also going to get Treasury guidance directly on some of the restrictions. It's not quite the same level of restrictions like we saw with the CARES Act, but again, there are restrictions that are in there. And I'm anticipating if it's similar to like CARES Act, the Treasury was very active in putting together FAQs and a lot of criteria and answering a lot of questions, because keeping in mind, we're one of 36 counties in Oregon that are getting this allocation, on top of it's every county in the United States or parish or county that's also getting these allocations. So I realize there's a lot of information that is still pending. As far as internally, there's several steps that I'm working on with our accounting team and also with the treasurer. Is one, receipt of the funds and in handling those logistics. There's going to require some budgetary action, and what I'm going to be recommending, and I'm still trying to determine whether or not it's going to require an additional supplemental budget or not. There's some provisions around grant funds that may not require a supplemental budget, but there will be some board action required, because I believe it's for this one and for this current fiscal year. And then when we start building the budget for the next fiscal year, I think it's going to be really important that we're able to track these funds. And so I'm going to recommend that we're going to be setting up a special revenue fund in the budgets to where we'll account for and track these funds in the budget. So that's going to be one of the first steps. And the second part is if you're not being contacted, which I know many of you are being contacted by various entities and proposals, and that's where I think, I like the idea of starting the discussion today, because I think that there's going to be probably a need for a series of work sessions and discussions about how the board would like to prioritize these funds, because I know there's discussions from everything from broadband to a proposal from YCAP to both. I'm doing assessment and looking at things, because we do have some internal needs to address as well, on how we comply with if I ever see, once I get an agreement from the Treasury, comply with the parameters within the agreement. But at the same time, how are we going to prioritize the use of funds and within that time frame? And I think it's, again, I really think it's going to require a lot of discussions. And I know that we have for next week with Abisha is giving an update, and she's also going to be discussing the economic development elements or the economic recovery portion of this as well, that also has a tie-in to this. The other thing that I think we need to keep in mind as well is the size and scope of the American Rescue Plan Act it's huge, and there's multiple funds that are going out. I mean, the county allocation is just one part of all this other fund distribution that's also taking place under all these various categories. And if you haven't seen the NACO analysis that has been put together, they do a nice job of not only providing a summary of the county direct funding, but they also provide information about all the other assistance programs and the funding streams going out to the other programs. And this is where it can get confusing. I use broadband as an example, because the broadband in particular, addressing broadband infrastructure it's an allowable expense under the county's allocation. But then there's also a separate capital relief program that also has broadband available in it. And so so that's going to be another thing to keep in mind when we're prioritizing and looking at things. Are we pulling from this fund where there's funding available over in this other program, and trying to navigate that? And I will say, I believe we have a daunting task ahead of us, because I mean, it's more than just $21 million is not insignificant. you know, and so being able to prioritize that, build that into the budget, identify the priorities on where we're spending and utilizing that money, and then how it complies with the criteria, but then also not necessarily spending funds out of this bucket of funds when we have the, and not potentially utilizing this other fund that's specifically targeted for that type of project. And so there's a lot to this, and so I just wanted to share a little bit more information, and I think this is going to possibly be an item that's going to require a lot of discussion, and it will also involve further discussion because this was not built into the 21-22 budget as proposed. And so that's going to be another discussion when we meet with the budget committee in May, is also adding whatever discussions that we're having now, is building that into the 21-22 budget as well. And then setting up that special revenue fund to ensure that we have expenditure authority to be able to access and utilize these funds based on the board's priorities.
Thank you. So, well, we have interest from, we've already had interest from a number of people. I know YCAP has expressed an interest in some of these funds, but I think, again, until we get a little bit more of specific information about where we can best utilize the money. So where, if money is going to, for instance, let's say money's going to CAP agencies or housing authorities or a broadband infrastructure, we make sure we have best use of that money. So would the consensus be that at this point we look for a little bit more information from Treasury, take a look at what NACO is putting out there, or as Commissioner Kula likes to say, what NACO is, we'll pick up what NACO is putting down? Does that work for you?
Oh, come on. You make me laugh. You cause me to laugh, and then I'm supposed to say something. But thank you, Chair. I'm picking up what you're putting down. I wonder, Ken, whether we have enough information, or we might have enough information after our update from Abishan next week to at least schedule some work sessions. And I really appreciate, commissioners, I really appreciate Ken's emphasis on the fact that there are multiple like focused funds that we should be very aware of as we set our own priorities. So hopefully we can look at the priority list that we put together last year, because obviously we need to reassess, but then look at what's the needs in our community as well when looking at all those different funds.
Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. So just for clarification, Ken, we have this pot of 21.77 million, but then these other funds, are those in addition to, and they're almost like you apply for grants and stuff for those, from those funds?
Correct. So it's 20.77 million.
Oh.
I have a tendency to round up, so I call it 21 million. But that is a direct allocation to Yamhill County.
Okay. Or let's say broadband, we might be able to pull from a different fund that's available and apply for grant. Okay.
Exactly. You know, because there's funds, and also recognizing that each city within Yamhill County is also getting a direct allocation. I mean, there's counties and cities, so these funds, so you have a lot of, you know, McMinnville should be getting a direct allocation. Yamhill County's getting a direct allocation. And you're right, how this is going to roll out, whether it's part of grant programs, if it's coming through the state, or if it's coming through the, you know, I still think there's some questions out there, because then also the state's getting a direct allocation. So I'm not sure how it interfaces with, I know like Business Oregon did a request for information about broadband and potential projects. I don't know if they're doing that work in anticipation that either they're going to be administering on behalf of the state one of those buckets of funds for broadband projects, or if they're also getting a direct allocation or a portion of that. So there's a ton of questions. The size and scope of this act and the amount of funds, I think there's going to be a lot of, you know, at times it's going to be challenging to track, well, how are these funds being made available? You know, because while I haven't even seen the agreement on what our allocation, and we're supposed to have it within the next, I'm preparing for a $10 million. I don't even know how the check's gonna, if it's a $10 million check, or, how that's the mechanics around that. So, so tons of questions, but that's a great point. And it looks like it's not part of the funds that were being allocated. They do have individual direct allocations that are happening for these other projects and priorities as well.
So should we just go ahead and figure that we're going to be having work sessions as, for instance, as the information comes in, we can schedule a work session based on that. So if we have no additional information next week, we don't necessarily have to have one, but if when the information comes in, we can schedule a work session. Does that make sense? Commissioner Berschauer.
Thank you, Chair. Remind me of the timeline for the first phase for the 50%. Is it 2023, 2022?
So the timelines. So what's supposed to happen is we're supposed to see the first disbursement within 60 days of passage. So we're looking at on or before May 10th. And then the second allocation is proposed to occur approximately 12 months later. But they haven't really been definitive and said that it's, yes, we're going to give you 50% now and 50% then. They're kind of vague on the timeline for the second disbursement, but they said, in the guidance, it appears it'll probably be 50% now and then 50% this time next year.
But in terms of when we have to spend it by?
And then the spending, it looks like I believe it's December 31st, 2024 is the deadline for spending these funds.
For all of them, no matter phase 1 or phase 2. Oh, okay.
Correct.
So I had a great meeting, and Ken was part of the meeting, but with Abisha about their said Corps' desire to be a part of these conversations. And we talked about what happened with the grants at the end of last year and some of the, pitfalls or criticisms, if you will, of those decisions being made outside of the county commission. The commission obviously had the ultimate authority to approve, but I think for me, I would want to be a part of those discussions a little bit earlier on. So I think the work session idea is good, but I would want to bring in some of our partners like Abisha and others to talk about what they're seeing in terms of kind of biggest bang for the buck for some of these dollars in terms of getting to folks who've been struggling through COVID. So that's what I would prefer to see. It would be helpful if we had some way to compile some of the asks that have come in, or maybe even set a deadline for, hey, after May 10th or whatever it is, we're going to be having a pretty big work session on this stuff. So if there are internal or external asks, you need to start sending those in so that we can start considering them, I guess. Is that appropriate?
The only hesitation that I would have is because we haven't before. I would say that anybody who is, a step ahead and they have a proposal that they've submitted that they want us, if you route those to me, I can hold those on file and have those readily available for discussion. I'm hesitant in kind of putting deadlines or timelines out because I also think it's going to depend on the discussions around the criteria and how the board prioritizes a solicitation. Because without kind of advertising that we're seeking proposals for X and we would like to have your proposal by this date, we don't have all the particulars around the requirements, and I'd like to be more specific and deliberate on what the solicitation looks like. I would just say that, we know that YCAP sent a proposal. I'd like to put that into the file and just say that, hey, it's in the file for consideration and discussion, but I would like to, first maybe start having some discussions, and we could extend invitations to our technical experts, if depending on the topic that we're, the first step might be is, well, let's figure it out. Well, here's our criteria. Let's talk about what falls under this criteria. And, are we talking business grants? Are we talking, internal projects? Are we talking business recovery? Are we talking capital projects, broadband? We could start to carve that up and maybe set individual work sessions on those topics. But the first step would be is climbing into the criteria and figuring out, well, the board comes up with a list of, this is what we think we may want to consider. And then we could start doing solicitation and invitations on those particular categories.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense as a way to kind of create that funnel that we can, be more deliberate in those solicitations and even identify, because I think the big part's going to be is how we entertain some of the discussions and priorities depends on how much money we want to set aside in each of those categories on the funds that are available. I'm sure someone could come in and make a $21 million proposal for the entire amount and how to spend that and how to utilize that, but again, it depends on how the board wants to prioritize having funds available in the various categories for grants, internal, external, broadband, all those specific projects.
Thank you, Ken. Commissioner Kula.
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to really say that actually the same thing as County Administrator, which is that I think a work session where we really know the criteria for spending of the money and the goal of it, right? I want to make sure that we're working on the goal, the values generated by it, but also then the eligibility criteria for funds going out the door. And I think my vision for that is very similar, as identify the areas that with our technical expert partners, we see as priority areas within the county and outside of the county operations, and then hold work sessions specifically for those areas.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and wait for more information and we'll decide whether or not we can schedule work sessions. But Commissioner Kula.
Yes, I'm sorry. And back to Commissioner Bershauer's comments about the previous round of funding, I think it would be, you touched on this a little bit, but I think it would be really helpful when we have a work session that's associated with it, subject matter wise, with a previous allocation, they say from the coronavirus relief funds, that we can look at how effective that money was spent. Like, did it achieve the purpose we had, or did we direct it in the wrong way? Was it a hammer rather than a screwdriver? So if we can keep that in mind as we work through this round, I would appreciate that.
And I want to remind, perhaps Commissioner Bershauer doesn't know, and maybe Commissioner Kula, I don't know if you were here when we used to do it, where the commissioners did have more input. That got to be a little bit much, so we asked for this special subcommittee at said court to take a look at these grants, and then we weighed in at the end. But I agree with you, Commissioner Bershauer. Last time there were some on there that were like, whoa, how did this make the cut? So, and then there were others that really did, they were worthy and they didn't. So I think I guess the most important thing is establishing what the criteria is. So before we have anybody apply for anything, everybody knows what the rules of engagement are. So thank you, Ken, for that. Thanks, commissioners. So at this time, we'll move on to consideration item I3, consideration of acceptance of a right-of-way easement deed from Ellen and Robert Rowe, donating right-of-way to the county for placement of a turnout and tourist information kiosk on Northeast Albertson. And that's where Councilor Sadlow comes in.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, this is a lovely elderly couple who's been trying to make this donation for the kiosk sign, the blue kiosk sign, for a couple of years, is what Mr. Rowe told me. And they finally came in and signed it, a right-of-way easement. And so now all we need is your acceptance of that through a motion and a vote, so that we can have the chair sign acceptance on the deed and we can record it.
Thank you very much. That's short and sweet. And I'll be happy to make the motion to accept the right-of-way easement. And thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Rowe. I have a motion out there. Any further discussion?
Chair, I'll just want to note that Public Works is really excited to see this on the agenda. So whole staff, very glad.
Thank you. Motion, further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. On to item I4, which is consideration of ratifying vaccine group eligibility request letter submitted to the governor's office by County Administrator and Public Health Administrator. Todd, did you have your hand up? No, he was saying goodbye. All righty. Bye. He's right next door. So we've all seen the letter that was really pretty much just a formality from the governor's office asking for us to submit a letter saying that we had actually addressed the previously eligible group. So we're moving on to the next. And thank you, Mr. Huffer, for writing that letter and submitting it so that that got in early. And thank you to Lindsay Manfred for that. So we have a motion to ratify that letter, which has been sent.
I move that we ratify the letter.
Motion to approve ratifying the letter. Any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The motion passes. On to item J, public hearings. We have none. Announcements. Any announcements? Ken? No? I do want to mention, and Todd, hopefully you're still within earshot about tomorrow's hearing regarding the court validation process that will be heard before a judge. And Todd is going to be, Todd has the dubious honor of pleading the case. So just really quickly, it's just asking the judge whether or not the county commissioners have the authority to proceed.
Correct. And as I was explaining to Commissioner Starrett, Chair Starrett, we don't even know who the judge is at this point, but we will find out when we probably get on the phone call, and maybe before, and if so, I'll let you know. The judge can rule from the bench or may have questions, and I think that's what we want to be there for, is to answer questions. And because we have submitted written explanations of what the action was and why we had the authority to do it. So the other option is that they could take it under advisement, but I would not expect that process to take a very long time to get a decision of some kind or other, a judgment, either that you had the authority to do it or that you don't.
And just a refresher course here, this is in relation to the resolution that we passed and regarding OSHA regulations and basically cover for business. So it was just a number of other counties had passed this, but this is the court validation, and the way you're going to be arguing it is a little different from the others. So
correct.
Thank you for that. All right, so that'll be interesting. Yes, Commissioner Kula, did you have?
Oh no, I just had, if we're on announcements, I did have two things real quick.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Appreciate that.
You're
And
welcome.
Commissioner Starrett, I'm sure remembers our opting into the state of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife's Wildlife Habitat Conservation Management Program, which is a tax deferral program for establishing and maintaining wildlife habitat. And I just wanted to give you an update that a coalition of soil water conservation districts is asking the governor's office, and then ultimately we'll be asking the short session to ensure funding for 2 wildlife conservation biologists within the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, because the linchpin has been that they haven't had enough biologists on staff to actually look at the habitat plans. So this would be an effort to actually be able to open it up to new landowners in order to either reduce their taxes or to move them from a category that they're currently not eligible for. I just wanted to give you a heads up that that's happening. And then the other thing is just real quickly that at the Public Works staff meeting this last week, one of our road supervisors noted that they slowly built up our utility positions, so the entry-level Public Works road crew, and they're now at 20% higher than they have been. And that what that looks like on the ground is about a 300% increase in the tasks getting done. So I just really feel like he was really proud of it, and I really wanted to pass that on to you, that sometimes really bumping it up on those really critical roles can get to a lot of work done. So thank you for that. And that's it for me.
Thank you, and we appreciate the road warriors' work out there. Saw them up there this winter, and they were definitely doing yeoman's work. So we appreciate that. Commissioner Bershauer, any announcements?
Thank you, Chair. I think I already talked about this, but it wasn't finalized. But the fairgrounds did receive ultimately that grant from the state chamber. So they've got the money in the bank, and they are working on the plans for potentially opening. It would be a scaled down fair in the summer, but other counties are proceeding with their fairs. So that's very exciting news. And I'm hoping that we can have a very successful one.
Thank you for that. I know the folks in Willamina are trying to make plans for their 4th of July celebration, and we're encouraging them to do that. And Lindsay Manfred had a great suggestion, as perhaps along a parade route, you just make it a longer route so folks are more spread out and they can still do this wonderful tradition. I do want to point out that I testified on behalf of those folks on Chehalem Mountain who are concerned about the dangers or the perceived dangers of the cannabis processing. I testified, a number of people testified, and it does not look like the bill is going to get any movement. But I think what we're going to try to work on is time, place, and manner challenges here in the county. So we'll do what we can, and perhaps bring the bill back in the long session and address some of the concerns that OLCC had. So that's that for that. We did our best, and we'll continue working on that. Anything else for the good of the order? All right, hearing none, thank you everybody for all your hard work all week, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.